Hey there folks, and welcome to the channel. Today I'm looking at setting up templates in a DAW or DAW and how I have a single template set up that I can load and it's ready to go whenever I want to record any of my hardware or tinker with some VSTs. I'll show you how all the tracks are set up, their routing and their MIDI channels. I'll look at group tracks, VCA tracks and effects tracks, as well as inserts and sends for effects, and how I configure things to display what I need when I need it using some customized keyboard shortcuts. I've set this template up to make life as simple as possible in a way that mirrors my physical setup. So whether working with or without the computer, everything pretty much functions the same. And I'll be using Cubase 14 Pro, but most of this is possible in other and lower versions of Cubase, and other DAWs will have similar capabilities. If all that sounds good to you, then hold on tight and let's begin. The template effectively comprises two main parts: the main project window that we can see here, and the mixer window that we can see here. Taking the main project window first, before we look at all the tracks that I have set up here, there's a few basics we need to do. First, you'll need to set up your audio interface to communicate with your DAW. Go to Studio and then Studio Setup, choose Audio System, and here you'll find a drop down to choose the driver for whatever interface you're using. Next, I need to set up the audio routing or buses for all the inputs and outputs from my audio interface. The number of buses will depend on what gear you have and how many inputs your audio interface has. If we again go to Studio, but this time click on Audio Connections, the Audio Connections screen comes up, and under the Input tab, I have a separate audio bus for each piece of hardware. Initially though, these would be blank. For clarity, a bus is basically a virtual signal path within your DAW that allows you to manage where the audio is coming from and where you want it sent to. First, I have my Rode Go wireless mic set as a mono bus. The audio device is my Audient Evo 16 audio interface, and the device port is analog 1, which is input 1 on my audio interface. Then I have my Voice Live unit on input 2. Next, I have my MODX8 Plus as a stereo bus with the device ports configured to 3 and 4, as those are what my MODX8 Plus is connected to, and so on for the rest of my gear, choosing mono or stereo buses as appropriate. In order to set these buses up in the first instance, click on Add Bus and then enter a name for it. Here I'm going to put example. Then choose whether you want it to be mono or stereo. I'll choose stereo in this case, and then click OK. And you'll see down here I've got a new audio bus that has been created. If I go across to audio device, this should automatically be populated with the audio interface you're using. And then under device port, click on the left and right inputs. If it's mono, there'll just be one input, and choose the correct audio interface inputs that the device you're setting up is connected to. Then, if we go to the Outputs tab, there should be a stereo out bus configured to the main outputs from your audio interface. If it's not there, you can click on Add Bus and create and configure it. So that's all the basics set up. Now let's have a look at how I have all the tracks set up for monitoring, recording and mixing. All my tracks are arranged into folders for ease of navigation and display. We have inputs and outputs, audio, MIDI, drums, VSTs, VCA and group. First I have the main input-output folder showing the main stereo out. If you've done those first basics that I covered at the start, this folder will automatically show up when you first open a project in Cubase. This folder also has all the other inputs from my audio interface, but I've hidden them as I don't need them on display here. Next, jumping to the group folder at the bottom, I've created some mix bus tracks, which are known in Cubase as group tracks. These aren't absolutely necessary, but I find them useful so I can send groups of instruments to one place for processing, rather than just sending everything to the main stereo out bus. I have 5 separate group tracks for vocals, guitar, synths, drums and then a main mix track. To create these, right-click in the project window, choose Add Group Track, and then give it a name and Add Track. When I come to create the individual tracks for all my synths, drums and vocals, etc., I'll then route them to the relevant group track, but more on that later. Also, you'll see I've colour-coded these group tracks: red for vocals, orange for guitars, amber for synths, yellow for drums, and purple for the main mix. But again, more on why I've done that later. Then I have the folder for all my audio tracks. This contains separate audio tracks for all the physical hardware that I want to record from. The first track is my vocals, and I have the input set to the Voice Live bus, which I created in Chapter 2. And that's where the audio signal is coming from. The output is then set as Vocal Mix, which is one of the group tracks I set up in Chapter 3, as that's where I want the audio signal to be sent to. The reason I send this vocal track to a vocal mix bus rather than straight to the stereo out is because inevitably I'll end up with more vocal tracks for things like harmonies, etc. And as I add them, they can all be routed to this vocal mix bus, so I can process all the vocal tracks in one place rather than individually. Next I have a guitar track with its input set to the guitar audio bus and its output to the guitar mix bus. Again, like the vocals, if I add more guitar tracks, they can all be routed to this single guitar mix bus. Then I have the audio tracks for each of my individual hardware synths and my TR-8S drum machine. Each of these have their input set as the respective audio bus for that instrument, and all of these have their output routed to the synth mix bus, except the drum machine, which goes to the drum mix bus, which you can see if I flick through them. Then I've colour-coded the audio tracks in line with how I set up the group tracks earlier: red for vocals, orange for guitar, amber for synths, and yellow for drums. Then we have a MIDI folder with MIDI tracks for each piece of hardware. Routing for MIDI tracks is a little different to audio tracks. For all these MIDI tracks, I have their main input set to all MIDI inputs. And if I go to Studio, Studio Setup, and MIDI Port Setup, I have all my main keyboard synths and MIDI controllers ticked under the In All MIDI Inputs section. This allows me to use any one of them to trigger any other one depending on their channel settings. So for example, if I want to record MIDI from my MODX8 Plus here using its keyboard, I can. But if I want to record that using my KeyStep 37 or my KeyStep Pro, I also can without having to change any of the routing in my DAW on the computer. The input channel for each synth is then set to the channel that each one is physically set to internally. So for example, my MODX8 Plus here is set to MIDI channel 1. And as you can then see, I have 6 hardware synths here, and each one is set to channels 1 to 6 respectively. Then for each synth, I set the output routing, which is which instrument I want the MIDI signal to go back out to, and then the channel that I want the output signal to be sent on, which will generally be the same as the input channel. I've then colour-coded the MIDI tracks pink. This doesn't correspond to any of the previous colouring, as these tracks contain no audio. It's just to separate them visually from the others. Next, I have the drum track folder. Here I have 3 VST drum instrument tracks and a MIDI track for my hardware TR-8S drum machine. These instruments are then each set to channels 7 to 10, following on from the synths that are on channels 1 to 6. The VST instrument tracks are combined audio and MIDI tracks, and so I've colour-coded them yellow for drums, as they'll be used in the audio mixing process later on. The TR-8S track is coded pink in line with the other hardware synth MIDI tracks. And then I have a VST folder with all my software synths. Now I have many VSTs and didn't want to set up individual tracks for every one, so I've set up one track per manufacturer and assigned each of those to a separate MIDI channel. For example, the first track here, Spectrasonics, is set to channel 11, but if I want to, I can go to the drop down where I've got Omnisphere. I can go to my Spectrasonics folder and choose any one of the 4 Spectrasonics VSTs. Steinberg is set to channel 12, and again, if I go to the drop down, I can choose from any 4 of my Steinberg VSTs. Korg is on channel 13, and if I go to the drop down, I have a choice of 7 VSTs. Roland is on channel 14 with 4 different VSTs, and Arturia is on channel 15. And if I go to the drop down, there is a whole load of VSTs here, as I have the full Arturia V collection. The last track differs slightly, as the Equator 2 VST is MPE capable, MPE standing for MIDI Polyphonic Expression, and is predominantly designed to be used with an MPE keyboard, like the Seaboard Rise, which I just so happen to have over here. What this allows me to do is to control all of my synths in my DAW the same as I would if I wasn't using the DAW, as it mirrors all the MIDI cabling and channel settings that I physically have. For example, on my Keystep 37 here, I can play any instrument, whether physical hardware or a VST in my DAW, just by changing MIDI channels on the fly, like this. Here's my Deep Mind on channel 3, my Polybrute on channel 4, my Omnisphere VST on channel 11, or say one of my Roland VSTs on channel 14. And on my Keylab 61 over here, I have the 10 snapshot buttons programmed to change between any one of my hardware or VST synths at the touch of a button. I've also programmed the knobs and the faders on my Keylab 61 to operate various CC functions like cutoff, resonance or amp envelopes for whichever synth I'm playing. And just for info, I'm going to be doing another video very soon on exactly how I've programmed the Keylab 61 to do all of that. Finally, in this section, the VST synths have been colour-coded amber for synths, in line with everything I've set up so far. So that's all the audio, MIDI, VST and group tracks set up, but what else? Well, I have a VCA folder, and this contains 4 VCA tracks, one for each group of instruments, like I did with the group tracks, for example, vocals, guitars, synth and drums. I'll cover more on these when we get to the mixer section, but to set these up, right click and click on Add VCA Track and give it a name. I also leave these as Create Inside Folder to keep all the tracks in one place. And then, as per previous, I've colour coded them. Red for vocals, orange for guitars, amber for synths and yellow for drums. Now, to help me navigate all of this, I've set up some shortcuts and configurations. First of all, by virtue of this folder structure, I can, for example, arm groups of tracks for recording with one click. For example, if I want to record the audio from all my hardware at once, say during a live jam session, I can just hit the record button on the audio folder and it will arm all the audio tracks to record in one go. Then if I want to disable tracks that I'm not using, I can highlight the relevant tracks, and I've set up the asterisk button on my computer keypad as a shortcut to disable or enable tracks. And then finally for this section, if we go to the configuration options on the toolbar, you'll see I have 5 configurations, and each of these is linked to a shortcut on my keypad. So if I press 1, I just get my audio tracks and everything else is hidden. If I press 2, I just get the MIDI tracks. 3, the drum tracks. 4, the VST synths. And 5 shows everything. In order to create these configurations, just select or hide whatever tracks you want to show, then click on Add Configuration and give it a name. To create the shortcuts, go to Edit and Key Commands, and you'll see here under Customized that I've got numbers 1, 2, 3, 4 and 5 set to configurations 1 to 5, And as mentioned earlier, I have the asterisk button set up to disable and enable tracks. Moving on, here is the main mixer screen, which you can open by pressing F3. I've configured the mixer into two separate views, one for recording that you can see here and one for mixing that you can see here. First of all, the recording view. This allows me to monitor all my levels when recording. I have inputs for all my hardware, then I have my VST tracks, and then I have my mix buses. There are no MIDI tracks showing as they don't contain any audio and so don't need to be monitored here. In order to configure this screen, if you open up the left-hand menu, you can select what you do or don't want to be visible using the check marks against various tracks. And then using the Zones tab, you can use these left, middle and right markers to separate them into groups. So you can see I've got hardware audio inputs on the left, then a small break, then VSTs, then a small break, and then the mix buses. Once you've got it how you want it, same as with the project window, you can go to configurations on the toolbar and add and save that configuration. Next up is the mixing view, and this is where I do all the mixing and apply effects after I've recorded to get a finished song before mastering it ready for release. Here on the left, you'll see all the tracks from my project screen for both hardware and software synths, and on the right, my VCA tracks, mix buses and the main stereo out. You'll also see I have a few basic effects plugins inserted on various tracks as standard. For example, on the vocal track I have a vocal chain and a vocal compressor effect inserted. And on the guitar track I have Guitar Rig 7. Then on my Pro 1 and Neutron hardware synths, I also have Guitar Rig inserted as I use this to enable some delay or reverb on these synths as they have no inbuilt effects like my others do and otherwise sound a bit dry and hollow. You can then see that the colour coding now becomes more apparent with the red for vocals, the orange for guitar, the amber for synths, either hardware or VST, and the yellow for drums, corresponding to the colour coding on my VCA and mix bus tracks. Also, for ease of recognition, I've colour coded the faders for various groups. So I have red faders for all the hardware audio tracks, orange faders for all the VST audio tracks, purple faders for the VCA, blue faders for the mix buses, and a green fader for the main stereo out. It just helps in being able to easily identify and grab a fader rather than having them all the same. These fader colours can be set by going to Edit and Preferences and then choosing Mix Console Fader Colours. And as you can see here, you can change the colour of the fader for the respective groups. With the VCA tracks that I created earlier, I've then linked each one to their respective instruments. For example, if I move the synth VCA fader, all the synth faders will move over on the left hand side, and the same for guitars, vocals and drums. What this allows me to do is mix all the elements individually with their own faders, but then have the ability to adjust the overall volume for that group of instruments whilst maintaining the same mix balance. For example, here I've randomly moved all the synth faders to different positions. Now, when I move the synth VCA fader, all the synth faders will move as before, but will all maintain their relative position to one another, like this. In order to link VCA tracks to individual tracks, highlight the tracks that you want. For example, I've highlighted my drum tracks here. Right-click over the faders and click Link Selected Channels. In this dialog box, tick Use VCA Channel and then choose the VCA track that you want to link everything to, in this case the drum VCA. You can also link other things here like volume, pan, EQ, etc., but I tend to leave all of these blank unless I want to change something all in one go across a whole group of instruments. And if I click on OK, you'll now see the link come up over the drum track, and now when I move the fader, all the drum track faders move at the same time. Now let's take a further look at routing and effects. In terms of routing, over on the right I have the 5 mix buses for vocals, guitar, synths, drums and the main mix. Each of the group of instruments on the left are sent to their respective mix bus, so the vocals go to the vocal mix bus, the guitar tracks to the guitar mix bus, all of the synths go to the synth mix bus, and the drums to the drum mix bus. This then allows me to place effects on those buses if I want. So rather than having the effects on each of the tracks, if they're all having the same effect, I can just process it all in one place on the respective mix bus. The 4 mix buses for vocals, guitars, synth and drums all then go to the main mix bus for overall processing. And on here I have a couple of EQ plugins, a compressor and a reverb. And then this main mix bus is sent to the main stereo out bus, which is the final signal that will be used when you do an audio mix down of the final track. Just a reminder though, this template is just a starting point and I then customise things as any project takes shape. For example, if I don't want the compressor and the reverb on the main mix bus to affect the drum track, I can take the drum track and route it straight to the stereo out, bypassing the effects on the main mix bus. Similarly, if I have an individual synth that I don't want any further processing on, I can route that straight to the stereo out instead of into the synth bus or the main mix. It's all completely flexible, and although some may say there are certain rules that you might need to follow when it comes to mixing and routing things, I think there's nothing wrong with just playing around, and sometimes that leads to some very happy accidents. And then finally on the template we have effects tracks. These are tracks that you can set up and then use a send instead of an insert to send instruments to that effect. I tend not to use them so much and so haven't included them in my base template here. But if you want to use or experiment with them, just right click, choose add an effect track, choose your effect, I've got Guitar Rig 7 here, and then give it a name, which I'll call GR7. And you'll see I now have an effect folder here with that effects track in it. Once this is set up, if we go back to our mixer screen, you'll see that I now have this Guitar Rig 7 FX track. And then if I go to the send section of any instrument, I can send it to that effect. So if you have multiple tracks that you all want to have the same effect on, instead of applying that effect on each track individually and copying all the settings across all the tracks, you can just set up one instance of that effect and then send all the synths you want to that effect track. As I say, I tend not to use them that much, as you can achieve similar by inserting effects on the mix buses. However, effects tracks can give you more control if needed. For example, if I want a reverb on say 3 synths but not any of the others, I can just send those 3 synths to a reverb effect track with the others bypassing it and going straight to the synth mix bus. Also, when sending tracks to an effects track, you have the option to send them pre or post fader. Pre-fader means that the audio signal is sent to the effect bus before the channel volume fader, and post fader means the signal is sent after the channel volume fader. For example, here I've got my Spectrasonics VST and I'm going to send it to the Guitar Rig 7 effects track over here. Blue indicates pre-fader, and if I click on it, it turns orange, which is for post fader. In pre-fader mode, the volume fader for that track only affects the volume of the synth, not the effect. So here, if I play a key, you can hear the synth and the distortion effect together. But if I turn the volume fader down all the way, you can no longer hear the synth sound, but the effect volume stays the same. You can just hear the distortion now, but you can't hear the original sound from the synth. And if I move the fader all the way to the top, we get the full sound of the synth along with the distortion effect. If, however, I change it to post fader or orange, now when I pull the fader down, it reduces the combined volume of both the synth and the effect. So here I'm going to play some notes and slowly drag the fader down. And as you can hear there, the total combined volume of the synth and the effect diminishes as you move the fader down. Effectively, this allows you to use the pre-fader option to adjust the wet-dry balance of the effect, with the post-fader controlling total volume. So that's pretty much everything, except finally, and most importantly, you'll need to save your template so it's there ready for you next time you go back into your DAW. To do this in Cubase, just go to File, Save as Template, and then type in a name under New Preset for whatever you want the template to be called. And then next time you open a new project, under the More tab here, you'll see a list of any templates that you've made. And that's about it. That is my go-to template that I open up anytime I want to record or do something in my DAW. I hope you've enjoyed this video and found it useful, and if you have, please don't forget to like, subscribe and ring that bell, as it really is appreciated. And if you have any questions, then please leave them in the comments down below and I will get back to you. Indeed, any other comments or feedback is of course gratefully received. Also, please check out the playlists on my channel, as there's a whole host of other videos on there that you might find useful. But for now, I've been Graeme, take care and catch you later.